Good evening and welcome to Your Brain on Food, a public talk about nutrition and the brain. My name is Tom Mickelson. I'm the President and Scientific Director of the Ontario Brain Institute. The OBI is a provincially funded, non-for-profit organization that accelerates discovery and innovation, benefiting both patients and the economy. Our collaborative team science approach promotes research and creates connections to improve the lives of those living with brain disorders. Today I'm joining you from my home kitchen, located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. In honor of tonight's talk, I'll be demonstrating the preparation of a brain-healthy meal, which is actually walnut-crusted wild salmon with steamed dark leafy greens and mushroom quinoa risotto. So let's get started. Okay, let's work on the salmon. We've chosen this fish because it's full of omega-3 fatty acids. It develops to help deliver oxygen to the brain, which allows us to retain new information while still remembering the old. It also contains DMAE, which is an organic compound produced in the brain and increases the production of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that benefits muscle movement, thinking, working memory, and other aspects of brain function. So I'm pressing 4 salmon fillets in a coating of Dijon mustard, chopped shallots, sea salt, black pepper, and then into a breading of spelt breadcrumbs and finely chopped walnuts. As you may know, walnuts are rich in antioxidants and vitamin E. But what you might not know is that they also have a significantly high concentration of DHA, which is a type of omega-3 fatty acid. DHA has been shown to protect brain health in newborns, improve cognitive performance in adults, and prevent or ameliorate age-related cognitive decline. So for the quinoa risotto in a medium skillet, you want to saute some sliced mushrooms and chopped bell peppers in olive oil until cooked, but still a bit firm. So once they're done, remove them from the heat and set aside. In a large pot, you want to toast the quinoa in coconut oil until it's fragrant, stirring often as it browns slightly. Add some minced garlic and sliced onions and saute until softened. So first of all, you might be asking, why quinoa and not rice? Quinoa actually has an abundance of B vitamins, which are essential for healthy brain function. And since quinoa is a slow-releasing carbohydrate and loaded with fiber and protein, it provides stable and energizing brain fuel. To cook the risotto, turn down the heat and add chicken or vegetable stock, cup by cup, while stirring frequently until all the liquid has been absorbed. Finish by stirring in the rest of the ingredients, plate, and garnish. Finally, for a simple steamed dark leafy greens side dish, we'll be using a mixture of greens, chard, collard, spinach, or whatever you have. Dark leafy greens are rich in phospholipids, which make up the insulation that forms around nerves and allows information to transmit quickly in the brain, helping to boost IQ. They're also rich in B vitamins, which help provide mental energy, boost your mood, and are essential for keeping your memory in good shape. So chop up the greens, steam for 2 minutes at most, and then season with salt to taste. And there you have it, a healthy and hearty brain-friendly dish. So bringing it back to tonight's talk, in addition to discussing how our brains can be supported by nutritious foods, our panel of experts will be discussing the link between gut and brain health, the interplay between our bodies and the food we eat, and how food can be medicine. So I'd now like to welcome our moderator, who is a biologist, science journalist, and author, Dr. Dan Riskin. Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much. I didn't know we were supposed to be preparing meals for this, so I did not. I'm not even in my kitchen. And if I were, whatever I cooked would not look as good as that. That was amazing. So thank you very much for that beginning to this and really setting the tone. And thank you everyone in attendance for coming tonight. I'll be your moderator for tonight's conversation about your brain on food, exploring the links between what we put in our mouths and what we get out of our minds. Now, we have a fabulous group of scientists on our panel, and I have an idea where I want this to go, but we want you to be involved too. So we're setting this up so you can submit questions as we go. You don't have to wait until the end. And I'm going to have those pop up on a screen while this is going on. So if you see me looking over to the side like this, you know I'm looking at the questions as they come in so that I can figure out how to insert them into the program. I really do want you to be an active participant here. And here's how you can post a question. You can use the chat function on the right side of your screen, or you can send us a direct message on Twitter, DM us, we're at Ontario Brain, or you can email us, communications@braininstitute.ca. All right, let's move on to the panelists. Dr. Jane Foster is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University in Hamilton. Jane thinks about food and the brain, but also about the microorganisms in our guts that mediate some of those relationships. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Professor Heather Keller is the Schlegel University of Waterloo Research Chair in Nutrition and Aging, cross-appointed at the University of Waterloo in the School of Public Health Sciences in the Faculty of Health and in the Department of Pharmacy in the Faculty of Science. Heather's work is focused on the ways in which our nutritional needs change as we get older, with an emphasis on the elderly, and we're going to talk about that as well. Dr. Elizabeth Donner is a neurologist and the director of the Comprehensive Epilepsy Program at the Hospital for Sick Children. She's also a professor and the Microbiome Chair in Epilepsy Research at the University of Toronto. Elizabeth's clinical work is focused on the medical, dietary, and surgical treatments of drug-resistant epilepsy in children, including treating epilepsy with dietary restriction, which we're going to talk about, of course. And finally, Dr. Edward Ruiz Narvaez is an associate professor of nutritional sciences at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Edward is a nutritional and genetic epidemiologist interested in an evolutionary perspective on current public health problems. So we'll get rolling here. I just want to remind you to send in your questions. We do have the Twitter handle and email address. We're going to put those up on the screen all over the place, so you'll be seeing that plenty. There's also a chat box on the right side of your screen, so you can always send us questions there. And now I want to get started because I'm tired of hearing myself talk. Elizabeth Donner, let's start with you because your work treating epilepsy through food really drives home the power of the connection between the gut and the brain. Can you tell us a bit about the work you do with ketogenic diets and epilepsy, and maybe start us off by telling us what a ketogenic diet is?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. I'm excited to be here tonight. So the ketogenic diet is a restricted diet that is high in fat and low in carbohydrate and encourages the body to make something called ketones. So when the body does not have its first usual fuel, which is sugar or carbohydrates, it will turn to burning fat. And when the body burns fat, it makes a breakdown product called ketones. And that's why we call this diet a ketogenic diet. And a lot of people might have heard of a ketogenic diet before because it's become quite popular lately for athletes and for weight loss. But we can actually use a ketogenic diet to treat epilepsy. When the body does not get carbohydrate, burns fats, and make those ketones become the fuel for the brain. And there's been centuries of kind of anecdotal evidence to suggest that when the body is starved and burns fat to make ketones, that in fact, people with epilepsy have less seizures.
That just seems so strange, but it really does drive home that there's a connection there. Do we understand the mechanism by which these chemicals have an effect on whether people have seizures or not?
Well, some of the amazing scientists on the panel might have more to say about the mechanism. I treat kids with epilepsy. I try to understand why the ketogenic diet might work, but scientists have been working hard to try and figure it out. In fact, I recently attended an international conference, virtually, unfortunately, where they were talking about some of the hypotheses as why the diet works. Some people believe that it is related to stabilizing blood sugars. Some people believe it's related to ketones themselves having an anti-seizure property. And some of the newer data even suggests that it may be tied in with that gut microbiome, which is such a hot topic these days. It's something you kind of tipped off on at the beginning.
Yes, we'll definitely go there. So that's great. And let's move across our panel just so everybody can get their voice into the conversation. But of course, I encourage all of you to just jump in if you want to add 2 cents. Jane, let's go with you. So epilepsy is a special case, and we're going to come back to that later. But let's zoom out to the general public. Your research ties together food and the brain and those microbes in the gut. So what is it that makes microbes such a hot topic, and why do you find it so interesting from a research perspective?
So our microbiome, or the microbiota in our gut, influences all aspects of the gut-brain axis, which communicates and influences in the brain. And in my case, I'm interested in how it affects mental health. But what's most interesting, just from a starting point, is that there's trillions of bacteria in our gastrointestinal tract. There's actually more bacteria than there are cells in our entire body. And these do things like influence the gastrointestinal barrier, They influence your immune system. They influence metabolism. And so in the past decade, starting with metabolic disorders and other aspects of biomedical science, people have really started to understand how these individual differences between my microbiome and your microbiome might influence our health, and also might influence both risk of disease, but also how we respond once we have a diagnosis. So there's a really an explosion in information that's occurring, and some of that suggests that, in fact, food through diet is a big factor that influences both the composition, the diversity, and the function of your microbiome. And so that can directly influence brain health and mood.
Yeah, so there are a lot of moving pieces here. There's what you eat, and then there's what's inside you eating the stuff you ate and what it produces and how that interacts with your body as it also pulls things out of that soup. It's incredibly complex. But going to, just the food that we take in. Heather Keller, I want to ask you about this. Your work is focused on the dietary needs of the elderly. And I was very surprised to learn that our dietary needs change so much as we get older. I mean, I expected, the calorie count to change, but I didn't think the ratios of nutrients that we should be taking in would change much at all. Can you walk me through a little bit, just how drastic that is?
Yeah, so we're learning obviously more every day about our micronutrient needs as well as macronutrient needs with age. But protein specifically increases in terms of its requirement as we age. And it's because our bodies change in our ability to absorb protein and use the protein that we eat. And so this means we actually need more protein than a younger adult to keep the muscle that we have. So there's this concern that we're seeing a lot of older adults lose their capacity for function, and it might be because of their loss of muscle, and perhaps diet has a large part to play in that, as well as obviously physical activity. The other two key nutrients that we see being definitely different with age are vitamin D and calcium. Those, we both need more of those. Changes again in our body physiologically that impact our capacity to use calcium and absorb vitamin D from the sun means we need to actually have more in our diet.
It's so interesting. I mean, so my mom's birthday's this week. She's going to be over for dinner on Thursday. And, I've got young kids. And so I'm always thinking like the protein's got to go into those kids because they're growing, their brains are growing. That's who needs the protein. But you're saying that because my mom, not to pick on her, but you're saying because people who are older can't break down the protein as well. They don't absorb the protein as well. So she may actually need as much or more protein compared to the kids.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you as well, quite frankly. So that's the interesting thing. It's about 50% more. Sorry?
Wow. 50. So who's 50% more? I'm 50% more than my kids?
No, your mother is 50% more than you for her body weight. So for an older adult, about 70 years of age, we recommend 1.25 grams per kilogram body weight or 1.5 grams, whereas a normal adult is somewhere between 0.8 and 1 gram.
Amazing. So that's just so interesting that the difference. So you'd think that once it gets in through the gate, it all goes to the same places, but apparently that's not true at all. So, Dr. Ruiz Narvaez, let's bring you in now. Our dietary needs change as we get older, but what about differences among people of the same age? So what's the role of genetics in making differences in terms of what people need to eat? Does that factor in at all?
Hi, thank you, Dan, for the question. Yes, that part of my research is to study how genes and diet interact to affect different health outcomes. And in particular, now I'm working in a study of longevity in Costa Rica, and one of our aims for this study is to understand how dietary patterns can affect different health outcomes. Right now, there are different genes that have been identified that interact with diet. Some of them are associated, for example, with risk of type 2 diabetes. People with certain risk variants for those genes, they seem to be some interaction with amount of fat, even with amount of proteins in the diet. We are still in the earliest steps to identify those variants that may interact with different diets and how they affect disease. And in particular, also, we need to take into account in different societies, different cultures. We can have different dietary patterns, then interaction could be not exactly the same in different groups. Then this is a very active field of research, trying to understand how diet and genes interact, and also with the microbiome that some of the previous panelists talked, how during how we age, even during evolutionary times, the microbiome has been changing, how being a reduction of the diversity, and then that's a very active field of research.
So this is great. So we've met the panelists now, and if you're in the audience watching this, I encourage you to become part of this discussion because questions are flying in, and we've already hit on a topic that everybody wants to hear more about. So I want to sort of fuel this fire a little bit before we move on to the other stuff that I have planned, because clearly this is where people are at. Keto diets. Everybody's just writing in. Everybody's got questions about keto diets. Is it safe for a regular person? Samira asks, what are the risks if you follow a keto diet? Chris is asking about whether it's recommended for someone with kidney disease. Adam is asking about evidence about the ketogenic diet on psychiatric disorders. So maybe what we'll do is we'll start with Elizabeth and ask you to just speak to whether ketogenic diets are unique to the epilepsy system, or whether there's the possibility that these might be a broad sort of medicine across more disorders.
Sure, and I kind of mentioned off the top that they've had a fair bit of kind of popular culture attention related to the use for a variety of conditions. First off, since I work with the Ontario Brain Institute, the sponsor of tonight's talk, studying epilepsy, I want to point out, and I am an epilepsy doctor, I want to point out that the diets that we use to treat epilepsy, the ketogenic diet that we use to treat epilepsy, can be quite a bit different from the ketogenic diets that a person might use for weight loss, for example. And so it is important, if you're using a ketogenic diet to treat a medical condition, and you also mentioned psychiatric conditions, kidney disease, if you're using a ketogenic diet like that, you do need to work with a registered dietitian. And in our work here at Sick Kids, we have 2 full-time registered dietitians who work with every child we put on a ketogenic diet. The thing about these diets is they're highly restrictive, and so they don't actually include all the necessary micronutrients that people need for good health, children and adults. And so for that reason, it's important to work with a dietitian to make sure you're getting the supplements you need and that you can use a ketogenic diet safely. So that's perhaps my first soapbox. Dan, you have to remind me what the other part of the question was.
Well, I mean, and then what about the rest of people? I mean, so ketogenic diets. But before you move on, you did mention something that I think is interesting, that when somebody thinks they're on a ketogenic diet, that's not the same as what you're giving these kids.
That's right. Because to actually get the body to make ketones, people need to be very restricted in carbohydrate. And we often think of carbohydrates as starch, like rice, bread, pasta, potatoes, things like that. But actually, carbohydrates are all sugars. So it includes the very healthy fruits and vegetables that we should all be eating. It includes dairy products. And so to truly restrict carbohydrates sufficient to have the body making ketones, you need to highly restrict those carbohydrates. And you also have to take pretty high doses of fat to kind of fuel the ketones. So it's possible that some of the types of diets that people are using may not exactly fit the strict ketogenic diet we use for epilepsy.
And Jane, maybe I'll get you to pipe in.
Weigh in on this. They're also experts on this.
Sure. Jane, maybe you could pipe in and just talk about how the ketogenic diet fits into overall gut health for the regular population who isn't trying to treat a specific illness.
So the ketogenic diet definitely impacts the microbiome, and I think that it probably affects a lot of the signaling that comes from the microbiome to the brain as well. And so what happens in those cases is that they with a restricted diet, there's also a restricted microbiome diversity. And so that can, in some cases, reduce the functionality. So for a healthy individual, that probably would have some negative consequences on some of the support systems that might come from having a diverse microbiome. The other thing is that, your microbiome and these microbes are little factories. And so they really do benefit from things like fiber in your diet and from some other, fermented foods and things we can do them, which would be absent in those restricted diet situations. And so some of the benefits that come from, your microbes taking the best out of your diet to keep that gastrointestinal barrier protected, that sort of would have some detriments potentially for long-term restricted diets from a bottom to the top perspective.
And Heather is someone who thinks about, oh, please go ahead. Yes.
I think it's really interesting based on what Jane said. So I mentioned I was at this international meeting, and I just saw a talk where they described animals with epilepsy who had been put on a ketogenic diet. And in fact, it was only when they had the change to their gut microbiome in these animals that they actually had the beneficial effects on seizures, with a reduction in seizures. So it is all way more intertwined than I think we completely understand.
But
if I could just make...
Yes.
Sorry, one comment on that. The other thing is, and I know some of that work coming out of, maybe it's Elaine Hissau's lab.
Yes.
But the other thing is there's a lot of individual differences in the microbiome. So one of the advantages of the microbiome, even in perhaps epilepsy, and who will benefit from the ketogenic diet, is quite often the baseline microbiota profile is a mix between our environment and our genetics. So some of the risk factors that are present in a person's genetics can influence how their microbiome responds to a particular treatment. So it's the biomarkers, using the microbiome as a biomarker to map some of these individual differences to predict who's going to benefit from a diet intervention is an area of great interest in the field.
That would be incredibly
Jane,
valuable. Yeah.
I keep stepping on you. There's just enough of a lag that I keep stepping on you. And please, if you hear me talk, just keep going right through, because I'm going to stop if you hear me step on you. Jane, let's talk about that gut microbiome a little bit, because I see some questions firing up there, and I've got to cull through this right away here. But you said something before about how some people have a very stable gut microbiome, and then other people have the gut microbiome that turns over a lot and changes its species composition quite a bit. How does that fit into the way that our food and our brain interact?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of great work in this area, and recently there's been a couple of key papers. So when people have looked over time at the same individuals, so if they take a group of 35 or 36 individuals and sample their microbiome multiple times and change their diet and look at the impact, what they've discovered is it's actually not those nutrients that make the difference to these big changes that happen. It's sort of the food classes. So that have an impact on microbiome profiles. But what's interesting is that some people actually have a very stable microbiome that doesn't respond as much to the diet. And some people actually have big dynamic changes in response to time of day and things. So again, I like to think of the microbiome as a signature of our overall health, but also of a bit of a life history signature. It sort of is influenced by our genetics, but it also sort of tells us how we respond to things. And there's a paper that just came out actually this week that suggests that you actually have to sample an individual a few times to see where do they land in this dynamic range in order to get a reliable readout of how they might respond to something. So it's fascinating to see that. And it's possible that some people will respond less at the level of the microbiome because, again, these individual differences, how do we get a person with a mental health issue or with epilepsy? There's a lot of different mechanisms involved, and not all of them might go through the gut.
We have a great question that came in via email from Ed, and maybe I'll give this to Heather. Just a question about different, not keto, but veganism and other kinds of diets, do you have a sense of how difficult it is to do those in a way that meets all the needs of the brain? What are your thoughts on when somebody comes into your office and announces that they're vegan? What kinds of things go through your mind when you think about that?
Well, certainly a vegetarian diet and a vegan diet are very healthy diets. The challenge of the vegan diet is it's very hard to get some key nutrients in sufficient amounts, B12 being one of them, but also vitamin D's. Very few foods. Comes through the sun, of course, through our skin, but if you're using sunscreen, you're not going to get enough vitamin D. Calcium is another nutrient that can be challenging to get, but it's really B12. Iron for some individuals too might be very challenging to get. So vegetarian, absolutely quite healthy, and the new Canada's Food Guide from 2019 is what I call Flexitarian, a mix of low fat animal based products as well as plant based products in terms of its protein, and so a very healthy diet. So I think if someone came in and said they're vegan, I'd say, okay, let's see what life stage you're at to see if there's some key nutrients that might be a challenge for you. Older adults specifically in my area are they getting enough high quality protein in the calories that they can maintain their body weight, as well as B12. That would be the key ones that I'm concerned about.
Dr. Ruiz Narvaez, you said before that you think of, so you're often thinking with this evolutionary perspective, and you have said that the way we respond to carbs is in a lot of ways equivalent to the way we respond to stress. I thought that was a very interesting idea. Can you explain that for me a little bit?
Yes, that's the overall idea is we and our past during the evolution of our species, the diet that we usually have in Western societies, they are not the usual diets that our ancestors had in the past. Then there are these ongoing discussion in the nutritional science field. What are the best diets to lose weight? Some evidence point to, for example, to keto or restricting carb. But a key factor here is the role that insulin in response to high carbohydrate loads diets. What we know from insulin, even when we think about insulin as regulating glucose metabolism, but insulin has a whole array of functions. Regulating glucose metabolism is one of them, but also regulating cell growth, lipogenesis, synthesis of proteins, and in particular seems to be involved in regulation to stress, or also involved in how the body responds to infection. And there is evidence that when we have an infection, we develop insulin resistance in the skeletal muscle, because we need resources, energy in order, for example, in the immune system, the insulin is working as a molecule to allocate energy to different parts of the body. Then maybe the way that we are responding to insulin in modern societies is because there is a mismatch between how our metabolism evolved and our current diets. Then some of the hypothesis going on, and this is one paper that I'm working on it, that maybe our body is interpreting the hyperinsulinemia as a chronic stress situation, and then it's going to lead to insulin resistance. In this paper that I'm working with one student of mine, we are proposing this idea that maybe the body is interpreted hyperinsulinemia as a chronic infection. Then that could lead to allocation of resources to visceral fat, because visceral fat is also, we know, that is an immune organ, not only a storage of fat. Then when talking about all these discussions about diet, different health outcomes, I think it's important to have an evolutionary perspective to understand why we respond to these different diets the way that we respond, and maybe because there is a mismatch between our evolutionary past and our current diet.
Jane, I wonder if you can throw microbes into that idea about stress and the immune system and diet and how the body responds to what's coming in. Because I mean, it does make sense that if we're eating things that we haven't eaten in our evolutionary past, our body might respond like it would with other kinds of pathogens or strange invaders, and if you have a response that is on the immune scale. Does that fit into the microbe story at all?
So one of the biggest pathways between microbes and your body and your brain is through the immune system. So without microbes, we wouldn't actually have an adaptive immune system. That develops postnatally when we're born, and those microbes initially educate the immune system, and as we go through life, they actually regulate the immune system. So a good microbiome population actually gives you an advantage for anti-inflammation or anti-inflammatory signaling, which affects your body and your brain. Stress, of course, can activate either directly or indirectly your immune system. So they're all, interactive. So the hypothalamus, which is the part of your brain that responds to stress, is also the part of your brain that responds to an infection. And both of those systems can activate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which then upregulates cortisol in your body, and all of that has a direct impact on your microbes. So these are, continual systems that talk to each other. And so it's that balance between our microbes, stress, and our immune system that can have both a resilient effect as well as a detrimental effect when it comes to brain health.
Elizabeth, when we talk about drugs and medicine, we're all conscious of the power they can have to alter a person's brain, but it's probably safe to say most of us aren't thinking about food as something that's as powerful. For example, I think given a choice, a lot of parents would assume that if they had a choice to treat their kids' disease with diet or drugs, they would probably assume that diet is going to be easier on the kids' bodies than treating with medicine. What's your experience been like with these extremely strict ketogenic diets, and what it's like for a kid who's on one of those diets compared to taking a drug, for example? Is it easier on them? Is it harder on them? What's the difference?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, Dan, because we do see a fair bit of families coming in saying, why would I give my child medicine to treat their seizures if I could treat it with food? But what we've learned over time is that, in fact, that strict ketogenic diet that I prescribe for kids to control their seizures is actually has sometimes more side effects than the medications that I prescribe. And food carries this tremendous cultural relevance. My colleagues on the panel, I'm sure, can speak to this as well. And when the food becomes the medicine, it really changes the home life and personal life and social life, family life of these kids and their families. In fact, we have a study ongoing right now where we've measured using kind of like standardized questionnaires. We've measured the family function, the levels of anxiety and worry and quality of life in the family prior to starting the ketogenic diet for these kids who have really quite difficult to control, difficult to live with epilepsy. And then we could use those same surveys to measure that family functioning and quality of life after 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months on the diet to see what truly is the effect of being on a restrictive ketogenic diet on the whole family. And so in about a year, maybe I can give you those results.
But you said something when we met earlier that really resonated for me and that I've been thinking about over and over ever since you said it, which is that we use food as a way of showing people that we love them. And I think it's just really profound to think about having to restrict foods for a kid. I mean, taking away pizza, taking away even a lot of vegetables that would be just yummy. And that must really be hard on a family.
Well, it goes both ways, because that is hard on a family. But we're talking about kids who sometimes have dozens or hundreds of seizures a day. And we have lots of kids who have an amazing outcome with either with dramatic reductions in the number of seizures they're having when they start this diet. And so really then the food becomes magic, and we have kids call it their magic diet. So it does go both ways. But the reason I'm trying to look at actually what is the effect on the family is not for us to kind of be a downer on the ketogenic diet, because I love using the ketogenic diet to treat kids with epilepsy because it offers help when medicines don't. But the reason I want to understand it is so that I can help to prepare families, and we can get them set up for success so that whatever challenges are down the road, they know to expect them, and they can work through them.
Kathleen has asked a great question here in the chat. How effective is, or why kids? Why is it kids that we're talking about for this ketogenic diet? Wouldn't it work for adults? Why are we not trying it there?
It does work for adults, but I described how restrictive it is, and it's pretty hard to stick to. So most of us know, like when we're kids, we kind of got to eat what our parents put in front of us, right? And that doesn't work as well for adults. Plus, some of the side effects for adults, some of the side effects of the ketogenic diet can affect adults differently. It can affect fertility, for example, women's menstrual cycles, and it can affect cholesterol levels and things like this. So it needs to be monitored a bit differently. But we are seeing a trend towards adults starting to use ketogenic diets for epilepsy. And I actually would encourage growth in that area because, 30% of people with epilepsy have seizures that aren't controlled with medication, and we need to figure out a way to help those people with their seizures. So I would encourage adults to explore that as much as is available.
Absolutely. We've got a question here from Samira for Dr. Keller. Does the type of protein matter, plant versus animal protein? Does it all go to the same place, or does that make a difference?
That's a really good question. So plant-based proteins tend not to have the same ratio of amino acids that animal-based proteins do. And of course, we are in essence having the same sort of muscle, if you will, as animals. And so amino acids from animals typically is in the right ratio. So it's more readily put into our muscle mass. So when it comes to plant-based proteins, some plants are better than others, like quinoa, for example, as we saw in the clip before, the salmon being made with the quinoa as a side. Quinoa is one of those proteins that is plant-based, that's actually better. But many of the plant-based proteins are missing an amino acid, or the ratio of amino acids is just not exactly right to make it easy to move into our muscle in the same way that animal-based protein is. So the efficiency, we call it that, is better with an animal-based protein. So take, for example, if I was to get 20 grams of protein from a plant-based protein food versus an animal-based protein food, the amount of calories actually is often less in the animal-based product food because it's pure protein, or mostly pure protein, right? Versus a plant-based protein's got fiber in there as well as carbohydrate. So that's the other key thing we have to think about, is not just the efficiency, but the balance of calories and protein. So for individuals who are older adults, for example, very low appetite, needing more protein, the more efficient protein for them to consume is often an animal-based product. Milk products, for example, low-fat milk products, chicken. Chicken's actually one of the most efficient proteins that we have, a lean cut of chicken breast or whatever. It's very high in protein, very low in calories compared to a cup of beans or a cup of lentils. You have to eat a lot more of that and more calories to get the same amount of protein bang that you get from the animal-based.
And where do you fall on supplements? We're getting a question from Eureka about whether you think supplements are a good idea, or if you think you're better off getting your nutrients from your food itself.
Yeah. So if we take micronutrient supplements like a multivitamin pill, that sort of thing, absolutely. I think the diet for most of us, if it's a varied diet, we're going to meet our needs. As Elizabeth said, though, the ketogenic diet is, I think she actually used the word starvation diet, because it's low in some key food products, which are then low in key nutrients. That's the place that supplements are going to be needed, obviously, because we do need micronutrients every day to make our body work the way it needs to work. And we sometimes forget that. We need to keep constantly eating micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, as well as the building blocks, protein in our body, to keep regenerating our body on a daily basis. I think a lot of people think, oh, once I'm grown up, I've hit 18, 20, I don't need to eat as well, right? My body's in great shape. Actually, no. We constantly are requiring micronutrients to keep our body working the way it needs to work. So supplements for individuals that have a restrictive diet, absolutely. Individuals who are not eating well. So I work in the area of older adults, specifically those with dementia as well. Appetite's often a significant problem. Unwillingness to eat, perhaps eating challenges. In that group where we have micronutrient malnutrition, supplements are going to be a beneficial thing. In addition, though, to the pill form, we might actually think about supplements that provide calories, protein, and micronutrients. I'm sure people who have tried the ketogenic diet have also tried some protein powders and things like that. Those are also what we would consider a supplement. I would always say food first, though, because there's things we're finding out as we've identified with Jane and with Elizabeth as well. There's things in our diet that feed our body that are not just vitamins and minerals, right? And so we're learning more and more about what's in our food and how beneficial it is for us. And even in the soil that it's grown in. For example, selenium, the content in our food will vary depending on the region of the world where selenium is in the soil. Right. And so it's really important for us, I think, to have a varied diet because we're going to make sure that we're going to be meeting those micronutrient needs as well as all the other beneficial things that are in our food, polyphenols, fibers, etc.
Jane, let's go back to that microbiome for a moment and talk about mood. It's a profound idea that if you have a depressive episode, it could have been driven by the little things living in your gut. But you believe that that isn't such a stretch?
No, I think there's a fair amount of evidence, both indirect and direct, that first of all, there's a lot of evidence to demonstrate that the profile of the microbiome in depressed individuals differs from that in healthy individuals. But there's a lot of evidence, even in healthy individuals, of a link between microbes in your gut and mood. So a lot of these microbiome based therapies, such as probiotics or even, taking in more high fiber and high fermented food can, in fact, affect mood even in healthy individuals. There is only just now starting to be, clinical trials in psychiatric patients. But I think this is one of those places where I'd return to my early point about individual differences, because these are not necessarily a panacea and they're not, as dramatically affecting that gut-brain axis as something like the ketogenic diet would be. So it's important to know, are these more of an adjunctive strategy, or do we really need to take a look to see who might benefit from that approach? Again, your question earlier about diet versus drug. There might be some people who respond very well to a drug, and they might be not the ones that would respond to something that changes the microbiome.
Now, if I want to know more about the microbiome and I want to try different probiotics, because I'll be honest with you, before I talked to you, I thought probiotic was an item that you could go to the store and get, and it's called probiotic, and that's the one you take, and it does all the things. But of course, there's a tremendous diversity of what actually lives there. And so where do I go if I want to try different types of probiotics out, or if I want to see if there's any evidence that a certain probiotic would help with mood or might help with brain health or something like that?
So there's a great organization. It's called the International Society for Prebiotics and Probiotics. Their website is www.isapp.org, I think. And they actually their mission is to educate people about prebiotics, probiotics, psychobiotics, but also about fermented foods, because fermented foods are these products that the bacteria have already processed. So whether there's bacteria in your fermented foods or not, what these bacteria do with our foods is they ferment them and generate these beneficial chemicals for us. So that's actually already present in some of the foods we eat as well. So the International Society for Prebiotics and Probiotics does that. And then there's also a website that is probioticchart.ca, which is maintained by a science person that's affiliated with the ISAPP. And that actually lists all the commercially available probiotics in Canada. It lists the content as in what bacteria is there, because the actual specific bacteria matters, and the clinical indications and the evidence that support it. So there's quite a bit of evidence out there in the scientific domain catered for the average person. And in that probioticchart.ca, it actually has different indications. So there's pediatric health, GI health, women's health, etc.
probioticchart.ca is where you would send me to go hunting for that variability.
Correct.
Great. Dr. Ruiz Narvaez, you are co-leading a long-term study on tens of thousands of African-American women in the USA. So, here we are, we're understanding the link between the food we eat and the brain. We're understanding why nutrition is important. Why are you looking at that specific population and asking the same types of questions that we've already addressed?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am co-investigator in this large-scale study, the Black Women Health Study. We are interested in different outcomes: breast cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes. And one of the reasons the leaders investigators decided to study African American women is because there is a need to study minority populations here, not in the United States, but also in other places that where we don't still know, for example, from a genetic point of view, where the genetic basis of some of these particular diseases in minority populations, because most of the study has been done in European ancestry populations. Also, going beyond genes, many of these minority populations, they are exposed to social factors, for example, exposure to racism, to neighborhood disadvantages, that can lead to chronic stress that is going to lead to other health outcomes for breast cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes again. And also I want to add, and maybe making the connection between different type of populations and health outcome. My training is mostly in epidemiology, genetic epidemiology, and nutritional epidemiology. One of my interests in research is to, for example, understand how diet affects disease. And participated also in this Costa Rican study of longevity. What we are learning, and we have sometimes we talk about food as a medicine. We are talking here about some condition that the diet can help, but also what we are learning is that we need to always remember the communal census of food. And that's something that also we observe in the Costa Rican population. The traditional diet is related to longevity. People eating a more traditional diet, they have a biomarker of aging, for example, telomere, that they are like they slow, rather they age slower in a slower rate. But it's part of the food, but also is part of the communal sense of the diet. People eating in family, eating with friends. Then besides all this connection between diet, the different macronutrients, the different chemical component of food, I think I would like to take this opportunity to make also this connection with the communal sense of food, because food is part of our culture. There are some food that make us remember our fathers, for example, when we were child, when we were kids. Maybe the beneficial effect of certain diets, they are going beyond that food per se, but maybe also the ability, the opportunity to share with people that we love. And those are some of the reasons also I'm interested in this aspect of diet, genes, behavior, or relation to different health outcomes.
So interesting. It really pushes it to the other end of the spectrum, doesn't it? I mean, you can think of the food you're eating as medicine, and you're thinking of it, put it in the plate and eat it and consume it and weigh it and make sure that you check all the different boxes. But then at the other side of that spectrum, it's you eat it because it reminds you of grandma, and because every time you cook it, the house fills with, grandma's spirit, and she's there, and that does something to your brain that only food can do, or only those smells can do. I think that's a very beautiful way to think about it. And I think some people are often surprised when scientists come up with stuff like that. But here you are as an evolutionary epidemiologist coming up with a very beautiful way to think about food.
Thank you. Yes, my parents are visiting.
That'll do it.
I remember in my childhood.
If I can just
and please.
Sorry. I had the fortune of studying families living with dementia, probably 15 years ago now. And we were more interested in not what they were eating, but what the mealtime meant to them. And as a dietitian, that made me realize the huge importance of the eating act and the importance of food to family. And it goes, as we've already been talking about with Elizabeth, talking about the challenges with the ketogenic diet and how that's a challenge for the family, right, to take on this diet. Or thinking about with Jane with the stress, how the immunity and stress and the microbiome are all linked. And then bring in the notion that when we eat with others, how does that change the stress level and the hormone level that then changes what we eat, perhaps, etc. So it's really a lot more complex, I think, than we have always thought about. And this huge importance of food to who we are, but also to our quality of life, our culture. And that's some of the work I do right now, actually, is persons living with dementia in long-term care and in other care facilities, the importance of meal times to them and their quality of life and what's happening with them now. It's not so much about what they're eating, but how they're eating and how food can keep them connected.
It's amazing that that's your research. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Dan, doesn't that bring us back to the time we're living in right now? Because it's hard sometimes to put your finger on why things are so hard right now, because there's so many possibilities. But on top of it, we really don't get to share meals with people the way we used to, right, with the pandemic. And I just think Heather's work is a really powerful way of demonstrating the importance of that.
Yeah, that it's a great point. And I think everybody in attendance has missed out on at least a couple meals in the last couple of years with people they would like to have sat down with, and it's turned into a Zoom call instead. And we've all been there. But I think also when people talk about these feelings that you get from food, and I'm really glad we're talking about this, because I think this is how a lot of us connect to food, and where, stress eating, food is there for me when I'm stressed. And so I shouldn't be eating these crackers, but I'm just going through them because I'm having a hard time. Or when I'm with people I love and I'm eating, or when I'm yelling at my kids and trying to get them to eat the stuff that I know is good for them. All these really special emotional things seem like they're different from research. But Heather, you're researching those connections. I think that's really interesting that's where the science goes for you. And this sort of fits into a big picture sort of philosophy you have about the power of research to change things. Do you want to talk a little bit about what motivates you to take on these perhaps harder questions that maybe are more interesting?
Oh, well, that's a really big question. So I think I learned more from my participants than anything. And so I can remember doing this study. It was called Eating Together. And as I say, it was a privilege of walking with families for 6 years, living with dementia in the community and what food meant to them. And I realized from that conversation that we had every year with those folks, the importance of food. And it really then changed my entire career, what the things I thought would be important that I wanted to look at for older adults. And so really brought in a sense of the social side of eating and how incredibly important it is. It's not just the food itself. And so when we're now seeing with COVID-19, for example, a lot of the issues of socialization, how that impacts everything, right? Including food, right? Including appetite, including health. And so I think there's a lot more to that part of food. And so I'm glad that you brought this up in this conversation today. Thinking then about older adults, then in long-term care, their quality of life, how can we actually support that? How can we train team members to build that relationship with a resident? That's probably the most important interaction they have that day, if they don't have family coming to visit them, to have someone to talk to them about something beyond their care tasks, for example. So I think it's a huge important thing that we need to be putting more emphasis on, especially thinking about acute care and long-term care, where we have individuals receiving care. They're stressed right now. They're going through a variety of recovery. The food is important for itself, absolutely, but the way we're providing that food can nurture them beyond, and we need to think about how we can do that better.
That's wonderful. Jane, we've got a great question from someone named Crystal, who has emailed in her question about whether there is testing available for microbiome health for kids. So, we see the microbiome as this huge possibility for health. If you've got someone in your family whose health is not where you want it to be, and you're thinking that maybe the microbiome is a solution, what kinds of resources can a person access to try to take that on?
So I think it's a great question, but I don't think that at this stage we have a reliable tool necessarily to measure what the different microbes are doing from that perspective. So there's not really a microbiome test per se. There's several places, just like 23andMe, you can get your DNA tested. There's a couple of different organizations that might tell you what your microbes do. That might give you an indication about diversity. I think particularly in children, there's some proxies for good gut health, and so without getting into too many details, things like frequency of your bowel movement or stool consistency or transit time, all of these things influence the microbes. But generally in kids and in aging people, more than probably the average adult, the more diverse your diet and your exercise is, the more diverse your microbiome is. And so quite often, I think, the first thing people would look for right now is a problem in one of those areas rather than a diagnostic test at this point. But it's coming. I think that we'll have that in the next, that's what's coming down the pipe as we learn more. But it probably will be a functional readout because just like any other biological system, there's a lot of redundancy in the system. So it's not necessarily microbe A that matters, but the ability to ferment fiber and produce short chain fatty acids that are beneficial with respect to inflammation.
So interesting. When you think about microbiomes and you think about fiber, I mean, I've always thought of fiber as just it just keeps things going, through the pipeline and make sure that everything is coming out in a timely fashion. But fiber is food for microbiome. It's habitat. It's what you're doing to sort of take care of that forest of individuals that live inside you. And when you think about fiber that way, it's not such an inert thing anymore, is it?
No, and it is without our microbes, we wouldn't be able to eat a lot of those plant-based fibers that we take in. That would be point number one. But there's a great paper that just came out very recently that compared the impact of high fiber versus already fermented foods on inflammation in a bunch of people. And the fiber question, so in the fermented foods, it improved inflammation and increased diversity of the microbiome. But in the high fiber individuals, it mattered what their microbiome looked like in the first place. So those individuals with a very low diversity of microbiome didn't benefit from the fiber. They had worse outcome. But if there was a bit more diversity at baseline, those individuals responded well to that dietary intervention. And I think that's probably, as we heard earlier about side effects related to the ketogenic diet, some of this can be influenced by how your body is balancing that environment and your genetics at the same time, which again, I think is where the microbiome is acting from an interface perspective.
I promised each of you that I would give you a chance to sort of, oh, please go ahead. Yes.
I was just going to ask Jane a question. So I do remember reading a paper about the microbiome and people living in residential care and how it's actually not as diverse as when you live in the community. And I'm just wondering if any further research has been done in that area and what you think are some of the ways we can combat that.
Yeah, I was thinking that actually I was writing it in the chat when Dan asked me that other question, but certainly people living in long-term care facilities have a less diverse microbiota than those living in that continue to live in their houses. And the suggestion is that it is related to diversity of diet, but it seems that there's also some of these social factors that Edward was referring to that might influence the way that those diverse diets interact. So social communication and social interaction seems to also be a big factor, particularly in the aging group. So yeah, it does seem to be that staying in your house and maybe that does relate to a more diverse diet tends to have a better microbiome.
That's just so interesting that the science is converging on this idea that it's not just what you eat, it's who you're eating with and what that experience is like. It's really a beautiful place to sort of take things. We have very little time left, and I promised each of you that I would give you an opportunity to sort of have a last word. So why don't I start with you, Jane? Is there just something you want to leave the audience with before we conclude tonight?
Yeah, I think that, food and mood are directly related, and that one of the important players is your microbes and your immune system. And so I think it's a great place to consider diet, exercise, to improve that aspect if that's a problem, or even just in general.
Thank you so much. Heather, I'll give you the microphone. Go ahead.
Great. I think I would have people take away that food is a lot more complex than we think. But also, on the other hand, it's simple. Eat whole foods, eat with others, enjoy the food you're eating, and move more. I think that's a prescription that everybody can live with and do better for by following something like that. So I would suggest think about the importance of food beyond the nutrients, the importance of food to family life, to your culture, to the way you interact and socialize, and how that also impacts obviously your health.
Thank you. Edward.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I want to close. Again, I want completely agree with my panelists here that enjoy food, your family, your friends, your social network of support, and also as a genetic epidemiologist, we talk about genes, how genes interact with diet. I want also to stress the point that we are born with our genes, but our genes, they are not our destiny. We are more than our genes. And then also I will say, enjoy life, enjoy a good plate of food with your family, your friends.
Thank you so much. And Elizabeth, to you.
Thanks, Dan. We've heard so much tonight about how important food is, and following up on Heather's comments about the importance of food in families and nutrition and how to eat right. I just want to remind people that if they're altering their diet, changing their diet to try and treat a condition, that they really do so with the supervision of a healthcare provider to make sure they're safe and they are as well as they can be.
I think that's a great point to make. And I just want to say from my perspective, I've moderated a few of these conversations with the Ontario Brain Institute, and it never fails that when you put interesting, smart people into a conversation together, you cover really interesting ground. And I'm really grateful to all of you for what you brought to this conversation and the way you bounced off each other's ideas. And I think we covered some really interesting topics. You were versatile and able to take questions from our audience. And I really enjoyed this, and I learned a lot. Even beyond what I learned in speaking to you as we prepared for this. So I'm really glad that you took the time. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
All right, we have some resources. We have some resources to share with you, the viewers, so you can have more information around this topic. We're going to post them on the screen shortly. They'll also be available on the OBI website. And one last thing, please, your feedback is valuable to us. I thought that was a great conversation, but maybe you feel differently, or maybe you felt like we touched on something that was especially meaningful to you. We have a way for you to tell us. We have a survey link in the chat box right now. So please do share your thoughts with us about tonight's talk, what you think we could do differently, how we could improve things, or what's working and you want to see more of. OBI's public talks are designed to share the latest knowledge on brain health and to offer simple tips to manage both health and wellness. The current set of public talks is called the Wellness Series, and that series explores the brain's vital relationship to nutrition and physical activity, the neurotech available to help improve our day-to-day lives, and personal stories of people living with brain disorders. So if you want to sign up for the next talk, which is in February, you can find a link in the chat box or, of course, on the website. So I guess with that, my name is Dan Riskin. I want to thank our panelists one more time. This is me clapping for our panelists. Thank you, panelists. There you are. Just fabulous. And clapping for each other. Great. And thank you to the Ontario Brain Institute for making this possible. And thank you, everyone who attended, especially those who submitted questions. Really appreciate your participation. Have a great night. Thank you.